can't believe I have to make a whole nother video just for this last question. That's very frustrating. But one thing I wanted to mention down here, this was actually a little bit crammed. That's a lot of numbers to kind of push in there. So what you can do is you can right click on the numbers, choose format the axis, and go down to alignment. You can do it at a couple other places. There are other menus to do with this, but and you can change your text direction. So for example, suppose you want it to be rotated 270 degrees, i.e. negative 90 degrees. I like that one a lot. So you can fiddle with that. I personally think this one's best because that way I can see the numbers in there and I'm not getting so crammed in. Okay. All right. So now back I go here. So what does this graph reveal about the U.S.? And this is kind of a loaded question because what happens is when you look at financial graphs, they're usually full of information. Open the Wall Street Journal or any Financial Times, really, and they will spend, and in particular, I'm fond of NPR's Planet Money. It's a great podcast. If you don't know a ton about the economic side of life, which I don't, but you find it interesting, they have a really good way of presenting it in a way that makes sense to somebody who doesn't have a large background in economics. But I also like them for the class because they tend to grab a lot of graphs that I can use in class. And particularly like a whole bunch of time series, like this one's a time series. That one isn't. That's a side-by-side bar graph. But remember from earlier in chapter 2, this is a time series. That's a time series, right? So I can use those in class a lot, so I tend to grab them. Okay, so when Planet Money or Wall Street or whoever, when they grab a graph, they usually talk about it for a whole, podcast or a whole page, or, well, some graphs, like, U.S. debt. Politicians and economists have been talking about this for years and years. Apparently there's a lot to talk about. So my question's a little bit jaded because, of course, there's all sorts of things that this is revealing about the U.S. But let's just do some simple statistics, student type stuff. Namely, we can see that there's been some high times and some lower times. Like there was a really low time in the early 2000s, right there. And then there's been spikes kind of in here. So it starts going up in 1970, 1979, somewhere like that. And it hits kind of a high in the early 80s. It hits another high in the early 90s. We hit a low in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then we climbed again in the mid 2000s. And then we have another spike over here, 2009, 2010. Okay, so that's kind of what I wrote. You didn't hear it, but I already made a video. But it got eaten by my machine here. So let me bring it back. There we go. So the percentage was very low in the 70s, right? And there have been spikes at about 10%. So we got a 10% spike here in the early 80s. We got another one in the early 90s. We achieved a low again. I shouldn't even write that in, but I'm going to do that. So there was a low from, it's really the late 90s to the early 2001 period, right? From the late 90s to the early 2000s. And that low, by the way, was at about 6%. Late 90s to early 2000s. And then there was a very large spike. It starts here in 2008, but it really kicks off in 2009 because the beginning of the spike is 2008. So let's just say, how about in 2009 and 2010? Let's start in 2009 to 2010. And it reaches a high of about 13% in 2010. That means that in 2010, roughly 13% of Americans required some food stamp assistance during the year, which is a lot. That's 13 in every 100 Americans. All right, we are done with 2.3. I will see you back here for section 2.4. See you then.